Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your Soviet Union, and in this one there are some advances across the front line in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians continue their advances along the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions in the north, as well as additional advances along the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhia region in the eastern parts. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions to the northeast of Pokrovsk, as they have now managed to operationally encircle the Russian forces at the spearhead of their offensive operations to the northeast of Pokrovsk, while positional battles continues over some settlements to cut off these positions completely. The Russians in turn continue their offensive operations to counterattack and reverse the situation. However, the Ukrainians are seeing more success over these past 24 hours. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional positions here to the southeast of Poltavka, where the Russians are slowly moving along the forest lines and fields to gain control over these positions east of the Yanchur River line, where the Ukrainians do not have a strong presence. Instead, they are mostly cleared. The Russians are launching some FPV drone strikes on the Ukrainian positions before storming with their own infantry after the areas have been cleared. This is to consolidate their positions following the capture of Olhivsky and fortified positions further north, where the Russians continued offensive operations along the defensive line, gaining control over additional fortifications here along the first defensive line in the Zaporizhia region, as well as the surrounding fortified positions near the settlements, the farm area, and the first line to the northwest. The Russians are continuing their offensive operations centered around the south of the river line, moving in the western direction, and to the east of the river line, moving in the northern direction, gain control over the area between the two river lines, allowing them to consolidate their positions following their gains along the fortified positions and the settlements, and then move on to river crossings in the western direction along the defensive line of the Ukrainians facing eastwards, centered around the river line. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks. This time they are storming the town of Boykivka, where they are pushing from the southern flank of Nikhanorivka in the direction of Boykivka. The Russians are still contesting the settlement of Nikhanorivka here to the north. As long as the Ukrainians have this foothold, they're able to resupply their forces fighting in the direction of Boykivka, gaining control over the fortified positions around the settlement and the western flank of Novotoretsk. The Ukrainians would be able to physically encircle the Russian forces operating to the north in the direction of Mayak, Nikhanorivka, Novoshakhove, and Kocherov Yar. It will also cut off the Russian counterattack operations in the direction of Shakhove from the western flank, which is aiming at cutting off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces operating in the direction of Volodymyrivka, Pankivka, and Shakhove to encircle the Ukrainian forces and gain control of these positions, securing the northern flank. This push towards Boykivka is a risky one because if it fails, then their flanks are exposed. The Russians can counterattack from Setishok in the south and Nikhanorivka in the north. Gaining control over Nikhanorivka or flanking the positions from the south would cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces storming the town. This means the Russians do still have ability to cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces and stabilize the situation. However, as it stands right now, the reality is that the Russian forces are very limited in their resupply of the forces in the direction of Kocherov Yar, Novoshakhove, and the western flank of Shakhove. They are likely being mainly resupplied through the use of drones that fly through the gray zones and the Ukrainian positions to reach the Russian positions and give them some supplies for them to continue fighting. So we're seeing a lot of heavy fighting taking place here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are looking to consolidate their positions and strengthen their flanks, while the Ukrainians are looking to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces, encircle them, and stabilize the situation for themselves here to the north of Pokrovsk, before doubling down on their operations to cut off the river line itself. They have gradually reduced the ambitions and objectives of their operations by cutting through here the western flank of Volodymyrivka and south of Nikhanorivka. They are attempting to cut off smaller parts of the Russian incursion here to the north of Pokrovsk rather than targeting the entire operation. As for the northern section of the front line in the direction of the Belgorod-Kharkiv border, the Russians continue offensive operations in the western direction, gaining control of additional parts of the forest patches as they continue moving on along the border area, widening the zone of control along the border section and looking to connect with the forces in the eastern direction. In conclusion, there's a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk direction, where the main defensive operations of the Ukrainians are taking place. On the western outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia region, the Russians have now captured over 200 square kilometers, and their advances are not slowing down. Instead, they continue on a daily basis. This has allowed the Russians to gain control over a significant portion of these western outskirts along the first and second lines of defense. As for the rest of the Donetsk region, a lot of Russian offensive operations are taking place sporadically through the front with no major section of the front line. Instead, they are all shared between the Liman, Serbiansky Forest area, Siversk, and Kostanivka sections of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.